The billionaire was fading away until he heard her say something he never thought possible. The hands that once sketched skylines could now barely grip a glass of water. Arthur Vance, the architectural prodigy, was dimming like a dying star. His wife, Eleanor, cared for him with a devotion that fooled the world, but her eyes held an icy truth. And in the midst of the weakness consuming him, a young physical therapist began to notice the cracks in the facade. She just never imagined that her discovery wouldn't just save a man, but the legacy of an entire lifetime, threatened by the very person who was supposed to protect it. The answer wasn't in the fortune that surrounded him, but in the fire that had once burned inside him. Arthur wasn't born into wealth. He was the son of a carpenter and a seamstress, a boy who saw angles and lines in everything. His first blueprints weren't made in computer programs, but on paper napkins in a cheap diner with a pencil he sharpened with his grandfather's pocket knife. There was an urgency in him, a need to pull the shapes from his mind and put them into the world, as if each drawing was a promise that he would not be forgotten. From the very beginning, he was different. While his college classmates dreamed of glass and steel skyscrapers, symbols of cold, hard power, Arthur dreamed of buildings that could breathe. He spoke of using sunlight as a brick, the wind as a fellow architect, and silence as a foundation. To him, a building wasn't a concrete conquest, but a living organism, a refuge meant to welcome and inspire people. This philosophy was initially seen as naive poetry, the ramblings of a young dreamer who didn't yet understand the brutality of the real estate market. But his genius was undeniable. His first major project, a cultural center that integrated an abandoned park into the building's structure, nearly bankrupted him. Everyone said it was impossible, a foolish risk. He gambled everything, worked through sleepless nights, and the result was a masterpiece that became a global benchmark in sustainable architecture. From then on, the name Arthur Vance became synonymous with innovation. He didn't just build, he sculpted the horizon. Every signed contract, every award he received was proof that his poetry was, after all, concrete and tangible. But the same flame that built him up began to consume him. The pressure to always be the genius, the endless travel, the sleepless nights. A little at a time, the passion became a burden. The sparkle in his eyes gave way to a profound exhaustion, an apathy that money couldn't cure. He stopped sketching on napkins. He stopped dreaming of buildings that breathed, and it was in this precise void that Eleanor, with her silent ambition, found the perfect space to grow. Arthur became a tired king in a castle he had built himself, but no longer recognized as his home. Yet even in the winter of his soul, one stubborn seed refused to die, buried under layers of apathy and exhaustion. It was his true and final wish, the work that would give meaning to all the others. It was called the Ark Project. It wasn't a building, it was an ecosystem, a vertical sanctuary designed not to defy nature but to merge with it. The idea that had haunted him for over a decade was to create a structure that could, in theory, survive completely isolated from the rest of the world. A place that would generate its own clean energy, treat and recycle every drop of its water, and produce its own food in vertical gardens, irrigated by a system he designed himself, inspired by ancient civilizations. It was a utopia, a stroke of mad genius, the kind of idea that either changes the world or completely destroys its creator. Lately, for Arthur, it felt like it was doing both. In his private office, locked away, dozens of black-covered notebooks held the secrets of the Ark. They were years of silent research, calculations for cross-ventilation that would eliminate the need for air conditioning, studies on organic solar panels that mimicked the photosynthesis of leaves, notes on how the sound of running water in internal channels could positively affect the mental health of its residents. He had traveled to deserts to understand how nomadic peoples protected themselves from heat, and to rainforests to observe how canopies managed sunlight. Every detail was an obsession a piece of a puzzle that only he could see fully assembled. Eleanor saw those notebooks as the diaries of an obsessed man, a dangerous fantasy. For Arthur, they were the map to humanity's future. The Ark was more than a technical challenge. It was his answer to a world he felt he had helped disfigure. He looked at the cities and saw his own buildings, beautiful, award-winning, but fundamentally sterile. Concrete monoliths that consumed rivers of energy and spewed pollution. He, the son of the carpenter who watched his father build furniture that lasted for generations, that served a clear purpose, had become a creator of disposable luxury. The Ark was his penance, his chance to leave behind something that wasn't just beautiful to look at, but vital, something that gave back more to the world than it took. It was the only work he didn't want to bear the name Arthur, the architect, but rather Arthur, the builder, like his father. It was his chance to come home, to rediscover the purpose that had been lost among million-dollar contracts and the empty praise of high society. But now, that dream was just a silent torture. The notebook sat on the shelf, gathering dust. The digital file with the prototypes was protected by a password that he, in his fog of exhaustion, struggled to remember. Eleanor, always practical and efficient, had already told the board of investors that the project was financially unviable, an expensive delusion that needed to be shelved to protect the company's health. And Arthur, with no strength to argue, didn't protest. Sometimes at night, he would open an image of the project on his tablet, look at the perfect lines, at the promise of a better future, and feel an unbridgeable chasm between the man he was and the man who had dreamed it. The Ark was his only safe harbor, but he was adrift, and the tide, controlled by hands he no longer understood, was pulling him further and further from the shore. It was on this tide of desolation that a new presence arrived at the mansion. It wasn't an investor, a friend, or a relative. It was Clara, young, quiet, with a gaze that seemed to see through appearances. Hired on a doctor's recommendation to maintain muscle tone for Arthur during his severe burnout crisis, she entered that cold house undaunted by the marble or the heavy silence. In her first assessment, she noted the obvious: the atrophy from disuse, the generalized weakness. But she also noted what wasn't in the medical report. Arthur's muscles responded to touch, his physical structure was intact. What was missing was the command. It was as if the ship's captain was in a deep sleep, or worse, being kept asleep. The days turned into weeks, and Clara, methodical and patient, began to log everything in her professional journal. And a terrifying pattern began to emerge in her notes. In the sessions that took place in the morning, before Eleanor appeared with a flawless smile and the tray of vitamins and supplements, Arthur was more present. He could hold her gaze for 2, maybe 3 seconds. A finger on his hand twitched involuntarily once when she mentioned aloud the name of an old architect he admired. They were crumbs of reaction, but they were something. However, about an hour after the morning medication, the fog returned. Dense, heavy, his eyes lost focus, saliva would pool at the corner of his mouth, and any response, no matter how small, would completely vanish. This wasn't a typical burnout case. It was something programmed, almost chemical. Clara began, very subtly, to change her tactics. She stopped focusing only on the muscles and started trying to reach the mind behind that wall of apathy. "This building right here," she'd say, gesturing toward a model on his bedroom shelf. "The way the light pours through this opening is just breathtaking. How did you even conceive of it?" She spoke about his drawings, about the texture of the wood he chose for his projects, trying to find any spark of interest. And that's when Eleanor, ever watchful, started to step in. She'd materialize in the doorway, holding a cup of tea. "Clara, darling, let's not overwhelm him, shall we?" The doctor was adamant about the need for absolute mental rest. Her tone was pure honey, but the message was cold steel. Eleanor saw her not as a help, but as an uncontrolled variable, someone who, unknowingly, was starting to ask the wrong questions. The confirmation of her suspicions came on a rainy Tuesday. Clara arrived 20 minutes early for the afternoon session, and the house was in an almost total silence. The door to the pantry, a small kitchen where Eleanor prepared Arthur's meals and medications, was ajar. Driven by an intuition that sent a chill down her spine, she approached on tiptoe, making no noise, and she saw it. Eleanor stood with her back to her, completely focused. On the granite countertop were 2 bottles. One was the expensive multivitamin, with the pharmacy label and prescription in plain sight. The other was a small, dark glass vial with no identification, no label at all. With the precision of a surgeon, Clara watched Eleanor open one of the capsules from the official bottle, carefully empty some of its contents into the sink, and refill it with a grayish-white powder she took from the clandestine vial. Then she closed the capsule and placed it back in the bottle, mixing it in with the others. The gesture was quick, clinical, and absolutely terrifying. But the worst was yet to come. And the worst, Clara would discover that night, wasn't a physical danger hidden in a vial. It was something crueler, slower, and infinitely more painful. The public annihilation of a legend, broadcast live to the entire world and orchestrated by the one who should have been safeguarding his memory. The event was the Acanthus Prize, the most important architectural award in the Americas. And that year, the night's great honoree, receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award, was Arthur Vance. It should have been his definitive coronation. Instead, it was his execution. The mansion had been transformed into a television studio, professional lights, a high-definition camera, and a huge monitor displaying the official broadcast. Eleanor was in control of everything. She dressed Arthur in an Italian linen suit she had chosen herself, adjusted his tie knot with a smile the cameras would adore, and minutes before going live, she handed him a capsule. "To help with the anxiety, my love. So your voice comes out strong," she whispered. It was the capsule Clara had seen her tamper with. The physical therapist watched from a corner of the room, feeling like a forced accomplice. Her duty was to intervene, but how? Scream that the devoted wife was a fraud in front of the film crew. Her helplessness was a knot in her throat, a weight in her stomach. She could only watch. The ceremony began with a moving tribute. A 10-minute video showcased Arthur's iconic works, from the first cultural center to the skyscrapers that seemed to touch the sky. World-renowned architects gave testimonials, calling him a visionary, a poet of concrete, the man who taught us that buildings can have souls. The footage showed a young, vibrant Arthur with the hungry eyes of someone who wanted to change the world. The production was flawless, building the image of a titan at the peak of his glory. When the video ended, the host, his voice thick with emotion, announced the award. "And to honor us with a few words, the master, the genius, Arthur Vance." The camera in the mansion closed in on his face. He looked elegant. The lighting favored him, but his eyes were lost, swimming in the chemical fog Eleanor had given him. She had positioned a teleprompter with the speech he had written, but he could barely focus on the letters. He opened his mouth, and what followed was an awkward silence that stretched for an eternity. Then he began to speak. His voice was a slurred mumble, the words dragging. I wanted to thank—" He paused, staring at an empty spot on the wall. "To thank my fourth-grade teacher, who gave me an A in drawing." A nervous, confused laugh escaped him. The virtual audience, made up of hundreds of famous faces in small windows, froze. The embarrassment was palpable. He tried again. "And my project, the Ark, it floats." He gestured with his hand in an uncoordinated way, and then stopped with a lost, childish smile, like a frightened child on stage. It was the image of a great man's ruin. Eleanor acted quickly. With an expression of pain and unconditional love, she approached, took the microphone from his hand, and addressed the camera. "I apologize to everyone. The emotion is overwhelming, and as you know, Arthur's health is very fragile. He thanks you all from the bottom of his heart. Thank you. And with a click, the feed from the mansion was cut, leaving the image of a heroic wife caring for her broken husband hanging in the air. Minutes later, the humiliation was sealed. On a news portal covering the event, Marcus appeared for an interview. His face was the most perfect mask of concern and respect. "Arthur is my greatest inspiration," he began, his voice serene. "To see him like this, so weakened, it breaks the hearts of all of us who admire him. He is a titan." Then came the final blow. "But perhaps," he continued, looking at the camera with false profundity, "moments like this teach us that even the greatest titans need to know when it's time to rest, to take care of themselves and pass the torch to a new generation to continue their legacy." He wasn't offering support. He was driving the nail into the coffin of Arthur's career, live for the whole world to see. The lights of the improvised studio went out one by one. The film crew packed their equipment in a respectful silence, casting pitying glances at Arthur, who remained seated in the armchair like a statue of himself. Eleanor dismissed everyone with polished efficiency, thanking them for their care and professionalism. When the last crew member closed the door, the mansion was swallowed by a deep silence. She walked over to Arthur, gave a cold kiss on his forehead, and said, in the soft voice of a nurse, "There, my love, it's over. Now you need to rest." And then she too was gone, leaving him alone in the vastness of the room he had designed himself. The glass walls, which once framed the city like a work of art, now seemed like dark mirrors, reflecting the image of a man he didn't recognize. A frail, hunched man, with the eyes of a prisoner. Slowly, the heavy fog of the medication began to dissipate, but what emerged in its place was infinitely worse. The sharp clarity of humiliation. He could hear the echo of his own disconnected words, see the frozen faces on the screen, feel the weight of contempt disguised as pity. He, who had spent his life building legacies, had become, in a single night, an anecdote. A sad story people would tell at dinner parties to illustrate the fragility of the human mind. It was the sound of a laugh that pulled him from his stupor, a clear, crystalline laugh, completely devoid of any sadness. It came from Eleanor's office down the hall. Moved by an instinct he didn't know he still possessed, Arthur stood up, his knees trembling, and walked slowly toward the slightly ajar door. Her voice was lively, conspiratorial. "Did you see their faces, Marcus? Pure panic and pity. It was better than I could have ever planned. No, he doesn't suspect a thing. He's as docile as a lamb." A pause, followed by more laughter. "Your speech? Oh, that was the cherry on top." The concerned air, talking about passing the torch. "It was a genius performance. After today, no one on the board will dare question us when we transfer full control of the ARC project to you. They'll think they're doing poor Arthur a favor." Each word was a physical blow, but there was no pain. Just a cold emptiness spreading through his chest. The truth didn't set him free. It annihilated him. He backed away from the door before she could notice his presence and dragged himself to the center of the room. The marble floor, cold beneath his feet, seemed the only real thing in this world of lies. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel sadness. He felt a profound absence of himself. The floor hadn't vanished. The floor had never really been there. He was a ghost, haunting the hallways of his own life, a piece in a game he didn't even know was being played. The great architect, the visionary, had been demolished from the inside, and the structure that remained was hollow. He slid down the wall and sat on the floor, hugging his knees, a deposed king in an empty palace. As the darkness of the mansion and of his soul swallowed Arthur, miles away, a small light glowed on Clara's phone screen. She re-watched the pathetic scene of the speech, not with pity, but with a growing fury. She didn't see a sick man. She saw a poisoned man. The symptoms were all too clear. The slurred speech, the mental confusion, the ataxia. They weren't from burnout. They were from intoxication. Her professional oath, her moral compass, her simple humanity, Everything screamed inside her. She couldn't be the only one who knew the truth and do nothing. On impulse, she grabbed her bag and her car keys. She would say she forgot a piece of measurement equipment. Any excuse would do. But her reason was different. It was a terrible premonition that the man she had just seen humiliated before the world was now completely alone, and that the next dose of vitamins could be the last. She just didn't know that someone was about to change everything. Have you ever felt silenced, even when all eyes were on you? Have you ever had to swallow the truth, watching the world believe a lie told about your life? If you understand what it's like to have your voice trapped inside, comment "me" down below, just so I know you're here with me and you understand the depth of this pain. Clara entered the mansion using the service key they had given her for the sessions. The excuse of having forgotten a piece of equipment was on the tip of her tongue, but it wasn't necessary. The house was submerged in an abnormal stillness. She found him in the gigantic living room, fallen, sitting on the cold marble floor, huddled against a pillar of exposed concrete that he himself had designed to look like it was holding up the sky. The TV screen, still on, showed Marcus's smug face in an interview. Next to Arthur, on the floor, an empty glass. He wasn't crying. He seemed to have gone beyond that, to a place where even tears could no longer reach. His gaze was fixed on nothing, the expression of a man who had surrendered. Any other professional would have rushed over, checked his pulse, started an emergency protocol. Not Clara. She saw that the pulse that needed checking was that of his soul, and no machine could measure that. She understood that the greatest danger there wasn't physical, it was surrender. In absolute silence, she walked to the center of the room, dragged a small leather stool, and sat a few feet away from him. Not too close to be an invasion, not too far to be indifferent. And she said nothing. She just stayed, witnessing, sharing the silence, the pain, the vastness of that room that had become a cathedral to his solitude. She took a deep breath, and it was as if, with each breath, she was trying to absorb a little of the pain that hung in the air. After minutes that felt like a lifetime, she finally spoke. Her voice was a whisper, a balm, completely devoid of pity. She didn't say, "It's going to be okay." She didn't say, "I know what's happening." She ignored the disaster of that night, the award, the humiliation. Her eyes swept over the models, the art books, and then settled on him, the man on the floor. "Arthur," she began, and his name sounded almost like a rescue. "Tell me something. What was the first thing you ever designed? Not the first famous building that was in a magazine, the very first thing, the one nobody knows about, that maybe doesn't even exist on paper anymore, only in your memory." The question was so unexpected, so radically displaced from the tragedy of the moment, that it achieved the impossible. It pierced the thick layer of apathy that enveloped him. He turned his head slowly, his eyes taking a long time to focus on her, as if she were an apparition. Why was she asking that? Why now? His voice, when it finally came, was a scratch of dry leaves, weak from disuse and pain. A treehouse. And then, he told her. With long pauses, with a faltering voice, he described it. He told her about a 2-story house in the old yellow trumpet tree in his parents' backyard, a refuge he built for his younger sister, who was afraid of the dark. He told her about the roof he made from old advertising signs he found on the street, about the pulley system he invented to raise and lower a bucket with cookies and comic books. He told her about the small window he cut into the wood, perfectly aligned so that the first ray of morning sun would hit her face directly. And as he spoke, something miraculous happened. A muscle in his face, paralyzed by pain, moved. A glimmer, shy and fragile as a candle flame in a storm, rekindled in the depths of his eyes. Clara didn't look at him with compassion. She smiled, genuinely fascinated by the story, like a child listening to a fairy tale. In that instant, in that cold room, he wasn't the humiliated genius. He wasn't the fragile patient. He wasn't the victim of a conspiracy. He was the boy who built a refuge in a tree to protect someone he loved. And for the first time in years, he felt that someone finally saw the real him. The next day, when Clara arrived for the session, the air in the mansion was different. Arthur was already waiting for her, sitting in an armchair by the window, no longer huddled on the floor. He looked at her as she entered, and in the silence that followed, a pact was sealed. They didn't need words. His gaze, still tired, but now with a determined focus, said, "I know that you know," and her subtle nod responded with clarity, "I'm with you until the end." Their alliance would not be built on plans and whispers, but on mutual trust, the most powerful weapon against an enemy who underestimated them both. From that moment on, the physical therapy ceased to be just about the body. It became about reclaiming the soul. The acid test came with breakfast. Like clockwork, Eleanor entered the room, radiant, balancing the silver tray. "Your vitamins, my dear, to give you strength." She placed the small bowl with the capsule and a glass of water on the table beside Arthur. Her eyes watched his every move, a mixture of staged care and vigilance. Clara, who was preparing her equipment in the other corner of the room, felt her heart race. Arthur picked up the capsule. He looked at it for a second, such a small object that held the power to nullify a man. He brought it to his mouth, took a sip of water, made a theatrical effort to swallow, and smiled weakly at his wife. "Thank you, darling." Eleanor, satisfied, kissed his forehead and left for her routine of phone calls. As soon as the door closed, Arthur tilted his head and, with his tongue, pushed the capsule into the palm of his hand. Damp, but intact, he handed it to Clara. It was a trophy. The first battle won in the silent war. The physical therapy sessions became the perfect cover for their rebellion. To Eleanor and the security cameras, they were just routine exercises. For Arthur and Clara, they were sessions of strategy and rebirth. While she helped him stretch a muscle, she would whisper, "Breathe deep. Feel the strength returning. They can't take this from you." And he, with his body still weak, began to fight back. And most importantly, he started drawing again. He began in secret, with a piece of charcoal he found in a drawer on a piece of cardboard. The first lines were shaky, hesitant, his hand out of practice, his mind still cloudy. There were days when frustration defeated him. He would look at the drawing, see only a shadow of his former talent, and throw the pencil away, his face clouded with doubt. "I can't do it anymore," he whispered one day, his voice choked. "Yes, you can," Clara replied with unshakable calm, picking the pencil up from the floor. "You built buildings that touch the clouds. Just start again, one line at a time." And he would begin again. He hid his new sketchbook under the mattress, like a teenager hiding a diary, and with each day the lines grew firmer. The architect was coming back. One afternoon, feeling a wave of clarity he hadn't experienced in years, he had an epiphany about the Ark's water purification system. He scribbled the idea frantically on a sheet of paper, the charcoal gliding with the urgency of old times. The solution was brilliant, simple, revolutionary. In the process, blinded by excitement, he crumpled up one of the initial sketches and, without thinking, threw it in the trash can next to the armchair. Hours later, Eleanor entered the room to pick up the snack tray. Her predator's eyes, trained to notice any detail out of place, locked onto the ball of paper. Curious, she picked it up. She smoothed the sheet out on the table. It wasn't just a random scribble. It was a detailed technical drawing, with notes and calculations in the margin. The hand that had drawn this was not that of a confused, incapacitated man. The loving smile on Eleanor's face vanished, replaced by a mask of ice-cold fury. She folded the paper slowly, methodically, and put it in her pocket. But the decision she would make would be one of no return. The discovery of the drawing was the trigger. Eleanor realized time was running out. The puppet was starting to cut his own strings. She could no longer wait for the slow, chemically induced illness to do its work. The next morning, she made her boldest and final move. She called an emergency meeting with the board of directors of Arthur's company. The official reason, sent in an email with a tone of urgency and sorrow, was the rapid and tragic deterioration of Arthur's neurological state, which required immediate and protective action for the stability of the company and his legacy. It was a coup d'etat disguised as an act of mercy. The boardroom was a sanctuary of power, a mahogany table with 20 seats, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city Arthur helped build, and in the air, a heavy silence of billion-dollar decisions. The board members, men and women with serious faces, had already been conditioned by months of Eleanor's reports and whispers. They saw the situation with sadness and her proposal as the only logical way out. Marcus was there, sitting beside her, with a humble and grave expression, the perfect reluctant air. Eleanor stood up, her eyes welling with tears in a prize-worthy performance. She spoke of her love for Arthur, of the pain of watching him disappear a little at a time, and of her duty as a wife and partner to protect his life's work. "It is the most painful decision I have ever had to make," she lied, her voice breaking at just the right moment. "But my duty is to protect Arthur's legacy, even if it means protecting it from himself." She then presented the paperwork, the total transfer of creative and administrative control to a transition council, led, of course, by Marcus. "It's what Arthur would have wanted," she concluded. The chairman of the board, an elderly man who thought of Arthur as a son, sighed heavily and picked up his pen. It was a formality: save the company, honor the man, sign. The tip of his pen was an inch from the paper when the double doors of the room swung open with a dull thud. It wasn't an assistant bringing coffee, it was Arthur. The silence that followed was absolute. Every face turned. The expressions ranged from disbelief to pure shock. Eleanor went pale, her jaw locked. Marcus froze, his hand halfway to a glass of water. This was not the man they had known for the past few months. Arthur was thinner, yes, but his shoulders were straight. He wasn't dragging his feet. His steps were firm, deliberate, and his eyes were no longer clouded. They were clear, sharp as razors, and they burned with a cold, patient fury. He wasn't wearing a robe, but a dark, impeccably tailored suit. In his right hand, he held not a cane, but a thick roll of architectural blueprints tied with a black ribbon. And right behind him, like a silent guardian, stood Clara, her face serene, but her eyes fixed on Eleanor. He walked without hurry to the empty head of the table. His seat. He didn't raise his voice. When he spoke, the sound was calm, but laden with an authority that made everyone in the room shrink. "Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for my delay. I heard you were discussing my legacy." He placed the roll of blueprints on the table. He looked at each board member one by one, and then his eyes locked on his wife. "It's true that I've been unwell, absent, but my illness wasn't burnout, as the forged report from a paid-off doctor suggested. My illness was poison. A poison served every day, in small doses with a loving smile, by my devoted wife here." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Eleanor tried to speak, but no words came out. Arthur didn't even blink. "A poison to keep me weak, confused, incapable, so that she, along with her accomplice and lover," he now looked directly at Marcus, who seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 seconds, "could deliver the final blow. The public humiliation was the first part of the plan. This meeting was meant to be the last." He unrolled the blueprints on the table with a swift gesture. The drawings of the ark, more detailed and brilliant than ever, spread across the wood. "You were about to transfer control of this. My soul, my dream. But it turns out, while I was supposedly incapacitated, I had a lot of time to think and to work. While you were planning my end, I was planning the future. This version of the ark is 10 years ahead of the one you know, and it, along with the rest of my estate, no longer belongs to Eleanor." He pulled a folded document from his pocket and threw it on the table. "My will was changed weeks ago, and all the evidence of your conspiracy, Eleanor, The tampered capsules my physical therapist saved, the recordings of your conversations with Marcus, the illegal bank transfers, is in the hands of the authorities. The silence in the room was as heavy as lead, broken only by the sound of a luxury pen falling from a director's hand and rolling across the floor. The king wasn't dead. He was back on his throne, and the judgment had only just begun. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the air conditioning. The directors' faces were plaster masks, paralyzed between comprehension and denial. The chairman's pen, lying on the floor, looked like an artifact from another era, from a time 5 minutes ago when the world still made sense. It was Eleanor who broke the silence. And it wasn't with a cry of remorse, but with a guttural sound, a mix of incredulous laughter and a sob of fury. "Crazy," she hissed, the word cutting through the air. "He's finally lost his mind completely, you see. This is what I was trying to protect you from." She stood up, the chair scraping loudly behind her, and pointed a trembling finger at Arthur. Her performance was now that of a cornered woman, fighting for her life. "He's having an episode, making up stories, paranoia. And you," she turned to Clara, her once angelic face now twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You opportunistic little nurse, what did you promise him to put on this show? Half the fortune. You filled his sick head with these lies." She turned back to the board, her eyes pleading. "Friends, you've known me for years. Do you really believe this?" Marcus, on the other hand, withered. If Eleanor was a predator fighting back, he was a rodent looking for a hole to hide in. He shrank in his chair, avoiding everyone's gaze, especially Arthur's. When the chairman stared him down, demanding an answer, Marcus's voice came out thin, pathetic. I swear, I didn't know about any of this. Eleanor, she assured me it was Arthur's wish, that he trusted me to run the Ark project. I was just trying to help. I was deceived as much as everyone here." He looked at Arthur, a shameful plea on his face. "Arthur, please, you know I've always admired your work." He was trying to appeal to a camaraderie that he himself had murdered. His cowardice was so explicit, so disgusting, that it almost surpassed his betrayal. It was this cowardice that finally broke the board's spell. Mr. Almeida, the chairman, slammed his palm on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "Enough!" he roared, his elderly face red with fury and above all with shame. "Enough lies!" He stood up, his body trembling with indignation. He looked at Eleanor with a disgust that she, accustomed only to admiration, had never received in her life. "We were blind, madam, and you are not a devoted wife. You are a monster." Other directors began to speak up. "I never trusted him," said a female director, pointing at Marcus. "Always hanging around, always with a compliment, just waiting for his turn." "And the financial transfers you authorized, Eleanor?" asked another. "The consultants no one ever met?" "We believed you. We were accomplices to your greed." The tide hadn't just turned. It had become a tsunami that was drowning them both in the middle of the room. As if on cue, the boardroom doors opened one last time. There was no drama, just the calm efficiency of consequence. 2 men in dark suits and impenetrable expressions entered, accompanied by the lawyer Arthur had hired, a man named Alvaro. He walked calmly to Mr. Almeida and handed him a folder. "A copy of the complete dossier for the board's records," he said. The 2 detectives approached the table. Their movements were slow, but irrefutable. "Eleanor Vance, Marcus Thorne," one of them said, his voice neutral and lethal. "We're here to invite you to accompany us to the station. There are some very serious questions that need answers." Eleanor's face finally broke. The fury, the denial, it all crumbled, giving way to the pure white panic of a caged animal. Ricardo simply lowered his head, defeated, amidst the controlled chaos of the scene, the shocked murmurs, the lawyer explaining procedures, the detectives waiting with deadly patience. Arthur met Clara's gaze from across the room. There was no triumph in his eyes, no revenge. There was only the deep, silent peace of a duty fulfilled. Justice, he realized, wasn't loud or glorious. It was just inevitable, and it had arrived. 1 week later, the noise of the storm had passed. Lawyers handled the bureaucracy. The press spun its narratives, and Eleanor's name went from socialite to villain. But in the penthouse where Arthur was recovering, a new kind of silence reigned. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of illness, but the clean calm that comes after a fever finally breaks. He stood on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun set and paint the sky orange and purple. Below, the lights of the city he helped ignite began to flicker on, one by one, like an electric heart. He looked at the imposing skyscrapers, the daring bridges, the monuments that bore his signature on every beam, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel pride. He felt a distant compassion, as if looking at the work of another man. It was there, in that moment of stillness, that the true lesson settled in his soul. Eleanor and Marcus weren't the cause of his fall. They were the symptom. The real disease, the one that nearly destroyed him, was older and had been cultivated by him. He had spent 30 years building an empire for the world, but had forgotten to build a home for himself. He had raised walls to shelter thousands of people, but his own internal walls were in ruins, fragile and hollow. The exhaustion, the burnout he called end-of-project fatigue, wasn't the result of Eleanor's plan. It was the door he had left wide open for her and her greed to walk through. They didn't knock him down. They just pushed a man who, in his arrogance and loneliness, was already dancing on the edge of a cliff. He had lost himself in the quest for a concrete legacy and had forgotten that the only legacy that matters is the peace you build within. Clara approached in silence, holding 2 steaming cups of tea. She stood beside him, just watching the city together. Nothing needed to be said. "I spent my whole life trying to be a titan," he said suddenly, his voice calm, without the weight of the past. "I thought strength was having no weaknesses, being as unshakable as the buildings I designed." He paused, breathing in the cool night air. "Now I see. Real strength is having the courage to look at your own ruins and decide to build something new, brick by brick. It's knowing how to ask for help." He turned to her, and for the first time, there was a small, genuine smile on his face. "You didn't cure me, Clara. You reminded me how to hold a pencil. The rest," he looked back at the horizon, "the rest is just the work of rebuilding." And in that moment, he didn't see the city as a conqueror, but as a craftsman, ready to begin, with calm and patience, his most difficult and important work, himself. In the months that followed, the dust from the explosion Arthur had caused in the boardroom began to settle, revealing a new horizon. The trial of Eleanor and Marcus was swift and brutal. The evidence was irrefutable. The toxicology reports from the capsules Clara had saved, the audio recordings, the bank records, and the testimony of board members. Facing condemnation from the justice system and, perhaps more devastatingly, the absolute contempt of the public and their peers, their names were erased from the annals of architecture and high society. They lost their licenses, their fortunes, and their freedom. They became ghosts, a footnote in a story over which they no longer had any control. And the Ark? The Ark was reborn from the ashes, stronger than ever. The scandal, ironically, gave the project the visibility that Arthur's idealism alone never could. Ethical investors, green tech funds, and even public support embraced the idea with unprecedented fervor. The board, now renewed and with unshakable loyalty to Arthur, gave him carte blanche. But the new leader of the project was a new Arthur. He assembled a team of young, idealistic architects and engineers, established humane working hours, and made sure his team's mental health was a priority. The Ark ceased to be the fever dream of one man and became the collaborative project of a community that believed in a better future. Arthur was never the same again, and that was his greatest victory. The chronic fatigue didn't magically disappear, but he learned to respect it. He was still a genius, But now he was a genius who knew when to stop, to breathe, to delegate, and most importantly, to live. He traded the cold, impersonal mansion for a smaller, warmer apartment, filled with plants and books that weren't just about architecture. And Clara, she was never just a physical therapist again. In one of his first decisions, as the reinstated chairman of the board, Arthur created a position for her, one that had never existed in the company: Director of Well-being and Ethics. Her job was to ensure that the company, in its pursuit of innovation, never again valued structures more than the people who built them. She accepted. They didn't become a fairy tale couple, but something perhaps rarer and stronger. Two survivors, two friends who found in each other a safe harbor. And together, from time to time, they would visit the foundations of the Ark, seeing not just a building being raised, but the proof that even from the most devastated ground, life, with care and truth, always finds a way to flourish. If this story of overcoming and rebirth touched you in some way, don't forget to leave a like to support our work and help more people get emotional with us. And tell me here in the comments what city you're watching from. I love to know how far our stories can travel. If you believe, just like I do, in the power of stories like this that show us the strength that can exist in vulnerability, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Now don't go just yet. Choose one of the two stories appearing on your screen. I'm sure one of them will grab you. Click on it, and I'll see you in the next video.